When I first moved into the old dorm building at my university, I had no reason to expect anything out of the ordinary. It was one of the oldest buildings on campus, sure, but the architecture was charming. Rustic brick walls, tall windows that let in the afternoon sunlight, and a sprawling courtyard that had a sort of ancient beauty. It didn't seem like the kind of place that could hide dark secrets. Or at least, I didn't think so at first. At first, everything was fine. My roommate Emily had been living there for a few weeks before me, and she seemed to adjust to the place with ease. We shared the typical college stories and laughed about the usual roommate quirks. But then, things started happening. At night, I would hear faint whispers just as I was drifting off to sleep. At first, I chalked it up to the wind, maybe a couple of students talking in the hallways. But the whispers seemed to grow louder every night, a low murmur that seemed to echo through the walls. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but they weren't comforting sounds. It felt like someone was just on the other side, close enough to hear, but too far to reach. Soon after, I started hearing footsteps, slow, deliberate steps pacing back and forth outside my door. The sound was unmistakable, the shuffle of shoes against the old wooden floor, sometimes followed by a soft dragging noise, as if someone was walking aimlessly in the hall. Every night, just as I was about to fall asleep, I would hear it. I would lie there, frozen under my blankets, listening as the footsteps moved closer to my door, then farther away, as though they were trapped in a loop. I never opened the door right away. It was always too late when I heard them, and by the time I would get up to check, the hall was empty, cold, and silent. It didn't make sense. I tried to tell myself it was just the old building settling or some other mundane explanation, but the anxiety kept building. I couldn't ignore the feeling of eyes on me, the sensation that I was being watched even when no one was around. Emily, of course, was the first to dismiss it. She'd lived there longer than me, and she always had an explanation. "It's just the old pipes, the wood creaking," she'd say. "The building's been here forever, and it makes noises." But after a while, even she couldn't deny the strange things happening. One night, I was sitting in the lounge when I met a student named Sarah who had graduated a few years before. She mentioned that she had lived in the very same dorm during her freshman year, and when I mentioned room 212, her face changed. She looked at me with a strange sort of hesitation, as if she were deciding how much to say. Finally, she leaned in closer. "Have you heard the stories?" she asked quietly, her voice barely a whisper. I looked at her, confused. "Stories? What do you mean?" She glanced around, making sure no one was listening. "Room 212. There's something about it. Something not right. There was a student who died in there years ago. They said it was an accident, but no one really knows what happened. After that, the room was haunted. Some people say the spirit never left." My heart raced as I processed her words. I couldn't believe it. I had only been living there a few weeks, and already strange things had been happening. But this was something else entirely. After that conversation, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the place. The next day, I went to the library and dug into the university's records. I found old articles and reports about the student's death. David Turner, a freshman who had been found lifeless in room 212 late one night. The report said it was an accident, a fall down the stairs in the building, but the circumstances surrounding his death were vague. There were whispers that it wasn't just an accident, that something more sinister had happened, something that hadn't been fully investigated. And despite renovations and updates to the building, the odd occurrences had only increased. I began to feel the pressure of it all weighing down on me, especially when the whispers began again. But this time, they were different. They weren't random. They were more focused, as though they were calling me. Each night, the whispers grew louder, and I could swear I could hear my name among them. "Sarah, Sarah." I started to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. I would wake up in the middle of the night to find the room colder than usual, the air thick with an oppressive silence. Sometimes, I would wake up to the feeling of someone standing in the corner of the room, just out of my line of sight. But when I would turn on the light, nothing was there. It wasn't just the whispers and the coldness. It was the sense of dread that seemed to hang over everything in that room. The walls themselves felt heavy, like they were closing in on me. The fear kept building every day. Each time I stepped inside, the unease becoming unbearable. One evening, I decided to confront the situation head-on. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I asked Emily if she had ever felt anything strange, and she paused before nodding slowly. "I thought I was just being paranoid at first," she said. "But yeah, sometimes I hear things too. It's like the building is alive." After that, we decided to dig deeper. Emily and I both began researching the building's history. We discovered that David Turner wasn't the only tragedy tied to room 212. Over the years, there had been other strange occurrences, students reporting sleep disturbances, odd shadows, and strange dreams in the room. All the signs pointed to one thing: the spirit of David Turner hadn't found peace. The next night, we went to room 212 together. I held my breath as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was dark, cold as usual, but this time I could feel something different, a palpable tension in the air. The whispers seemed to rise in pitch as we entered, and the room seemed to hum with energy. As I stood in the center, I felt it, a rush of cold air against my skin, followed by a faint, fleeting shadow at the corner of my eye. The unease in my chest grew, and for the first time, I knew the truth. There was something here with me, something lost, angry, and desperate to be remembered. I never felt safe in room 212 again. Every night, I would leave the dorm, looking for any excuse not to return. The whispers never stopped, and the cold never left. In the end, I couldn't stay in that room anymore. I moved out, but the memories lingered, and I could never shake the feeling that the spirit of David Turner was still there, waiting for someone else to walk through that door. And every time I pass that dorm building, I can't help but glance up at the windows of room 212, wondering if the whispers are still there. It was the second week of my sophomore year when I first noticed her. Her name was Claire, and she always sat in the seat next to me in every class. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. After all, students often sit in the same spots, especially in large lecture halls where everyone is still figuring out where they belong. But there was something off about her, something that made me feel uneasy. Claire was quiet, more reserved than the other students, but she had an intense way of focusing that made her seem like she knew everything. It was a little strange, but not enough to raise any real alarms. What started to unsettle me was how much she seemed to know about me. At first, it was subtle, small comments about things I'd mentioned in passing, questions about my family that I had never shared in class. "How's your mom doing?" "I know she's been sick," she once asked, as if she had been following my personal life. It was jarring, but I brushed it off as mere coincidence. After all, maybe she had overheard me talking to someone, or perhaps she was just observant. But then it started happening more frequently. She would ask about specific details that no one else knew, like when I'd taken a trip to visit family in another state, or when I was planning to see my high school friends again. It was as if she had access to all the things I'd kept private, and that bothered me more and more each time. It was like she had somehow wormed her way into my life without me realizing it. Things took an even stranger turn when I went to the library one evening to study for an upcoming exam. It was a quiet time of day, and the library was mostly empty, except for a few students here and there. I settled into my usual corner, spreading out my books and notes. Then, to my surprise, I saw Claire, sitting directly across from me, staring intently at her own pile of books. I hadn't mentioned the library to anyone, let alone Claire, and yet there she was, in the exact spot where I always studied. It made no sense. I tried to focus on my work, but the feeling of being watched kept growing stronger. Every time I looked up from my notes, I would catch Claire's gaze. Her eyes would flicker for a moment, as though she was waiting for me to notice her. It became an obsession for me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. It wasn't just that she was there, at the library. It was how she seemed to always be there, exactly where I was, without me ever telling her where I'd be. I began to wonder if I was imagining things, if maybe I was just being paranoid. But then the small things started to pile up. I had never seen her anywhere outside of class or the library. Not on campus, not walking to class, not in the cafeteria. I'd never bumped into her in the hallways, never caught her in the parking lot. It was as if she existed only in the two places I frequented most, my classes and the library. The unease started to grow, and one day I decided to take action. I went to our professor after class and casually asked about Claire. "Do you know a student named Claire?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "She always sits next to me in every class." The professor looked at me with a raised eyebrow, then shook his head. "I'm not sure who you're talking about," he said, his tone confused. "There's no student named Claire in this class." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "What do you mean?" "She's in every class with me," I stammered. The professor looked at me like I was joking. "There's no Claire here, and there's no record of her in any department. Maybe you've mistaken her for someone else." I couldn't believe it. I was sure I hadn't made a mistake. Claire had been there every day, sitting right next to me. But the professor's response made me doubt everything I thought I knew. The next day, I tried to find her again. I went to class early, hoping to catch her before the lecture began. I scanned the seats, looking for Claire's usual spot. But when I arrived, her seat was empty. And when the lecture started, there was no sign of her. I tried to shake off the feeling of panic building in my chest, but I couldn't ignore it. Where was she? I spent the rest of the day obsessively trying to find her, but she was nowhere to be found. No one knew her. No one had ever seen her in any other class. And the more I searched, the more I started to realize something terrifying. Claire didn't exist. Not in any official records, not in any memory other than mine. That evening, unable to sleep, I decided to go to the university's archives and dig deeper. I went through old yearbooks and class photos from years past, hoping to find some clue that would explain the mystery of Claire. After hours of searching, I came across an old photo from a few years earlier. There, in the middle of the group shot, was Claire. The same face, the same calm expression, but the date on the yearbook photo was years before I even enrolled. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the caption. "In loving memory of Claire Miller," it read. "Passed away in a tragic car accident in 2013. The date matched up perfectly. Claire had been dead for years. I couldn't comprehend it. How had she been sitting next to me in class all this time? How had I seen her so clearly? The image of her sitting across from me in the library haunted me, her eyes staring back at me with that unsettling calmness. Was it a ghost? Was she trying to communicate something from beyond the grave? To this day, I have no explanation for what happened. I'll never forget the ghostly classmate who wasn't supposed to be there. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still feel her presence, as if she's watching me from the corner of the room, quiet, observant, and waiting. I was a freshman when I first discovered the dark, abandoned basement of the university library. The building itself was ancient, a towering structure with crooked shelves that seemed to hold secrets in every dusty corner. It had a reputation for being a maze, full of hidden rooms and forgotten corridors, with whispers of old legends passed down among the students. Some claimed the place was haunted. Others believed it was simply the weight of its history that made the library so unsettling. One night, after a long stretch of studying, I decided to stay late in the library. The campus was quiet, and I enjoyed the peacefulness of being there when everyone else had gone home. As the hours passed, I found myself wandering aimlessly, searching for something new to explore, and that's when I stumbled upon it. I had passed by the narrow hallway before, but never paid much attention to it. On this particular night, however, the dim light from the old sconces seemed to beckon me. At the end of the hallway, hidden from most students' sight, was a rusted door. It looked out of place, ancient and forgotten. It was slightly ajar, and a sense of curiosity swept over me, urging me to push it open. I had no idea what I was about to find. The room was unlike any other in the library. It was dark, its walls lined with shelves of long-forgotten books. But it wasn't just the old decaying books that made the room feel eerie. It was the air. It felt thick, suffocating, as if something had been left to fester in this space for years. The room was untouched by time, with a layer of dust so thick it seemed to have settled into every corner. A heavy silence hung in the air, pressing down on me as if the room itself were waiting for something. In the center of the room, there was an old wooden table. The wood was cracked, and it seemed as though no one had disturbed it in ages. Surrounding it were cracked chairs, some of them overturned, as if they had been hastily abandoned. But it was the walls that truly caught my attention. Strange symbols had been etched into the wood, their meanings completely foreign to me. They were intricate, almost hypnotic, like some forgotten language meant to be deciphered by someone or something else. I was drawn to the table, and without thinking, I walked over and sat down. As soon as I did, I felt an icy chill wash over me, like the room had suddenly dropped several degrees. It was as if the temperature had shifted on some invisible scale, and now I could feel every breath, every heartbeat, as if they were being measured. The hairs on my neck stood on end, and I had the overwhelming sensation that something was watching me. It wasn't a feeling of being alone in the room. It was the opposite. It was like something was just behind me, waiting for me to notice it. I turned around, but the room remained empty, the darkness swallowing any trace of life that might have been there. Then the whispers started. At first, it was faint, just a soft murmur that seemed to come from every direction. I thought it was my imagination, but the longer I sat there, the louder it grew. The voices became clearer, more distinct, as if they were speaking directly to me. I couldn't make out the words, but I could hear the urgency in their tone. I spun around again, but there was no one there, no one in the room but me. The shadows on the walls began to shift. It was subtle at first, like a trick of the light, but then I saw it. A dark shape, a movement where there shouldn't have been any. It crossed the wall, slipping across the faded, crumbling bookshelves like a living thing. I jumped to my feet, panic rising in my chest. The whispers grew louder, turning into an unbearable cacophony of voices. It was like the room itself was alive, pushing against me, demanding I leave. I reached for the door, my hands shaking, but when I pulled on the handle, it wouldn't budge. The door felt cold and stubborn, as if something, or someone, was holding it shut from the other side. I yanked at it, but it wouldn't open. My heart raced in my chest, and the whispers grew louder, louder still, until it was all I could hear. I was trapped in the room, the darkness closing in around me. Time seemed to stretch into eternity. I pounded on the door, screaming for help, but no sound seemed to escape the room. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the temperature dropped even further, until I could see my breath in front of me. I had no idea how long I was in there, but I finally managed to push the door open, just as the whispers reached a deafening crescendo. I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't look back. I ran straight to the nearest exit, and when I looked over my shoulder, the hallway seemed empty, the library silent once again. The next day, I returned to the basement, eager to understand what had happened, to make sense of the night's events. But when I reached the door, I froze. It was sealed shut. There was no rusted handle, no faint crack in the wood. The door had disappeared, replaced by an ordinary wall, as though it had never been there. I found the librarian soon after. He was an older man, always distant, but when I mentioned the room and the strange symbols, his face paled. He looked at me, his eyes filled with an unsettling mix of fear and sadness. "That room should have been sealed years ago," he told me in a hushed voice. "It's not meant for anyone to find. No one should ever have gone in there." When I pressed him for more information, he hesitated before adding, "Several students have gone missing in that room over the years. No one knows what happens to them, but they never return. The room has a history, a dangerous one. It's best if you forget about it." I never did go back, but I'll never forget the feeling of being trapped in that room, surrounded by shadows and whispers, held captive by something far older and darker than I could have ever imagined. The room may be sealed, but I can still hear the whispers sometimes, just on the edge of my hearing, waiting for someone else to stumble in.